Picture a spring morning, a Sunday. The kind of morning where kids sleep in late and the smell of pine trees covers everything like a blanket. Keddie, California. A tiny community lost in the mountains of the Sierra Nevada. 33 wooden cabins, an ice-cold river, trails filled with birdsong. The kind of place where people go to escape the city, the problems, the life that didn't quite work out. Sue Sharp had come here to escape. She was 36 years old, had 5 children, and carried a quiet kind of courage that most people never noticed. She had left an abusive marriage back in Connecticut, driven across the country, and found something like a fresh start at this mountain resort. Cabin 28 was modest, but it was hers. It was theirs. On the morning of Sunday, April 12, 1981, Sue's oldest daughter, Sheila, 14 years old, walked back from a slumber party at the neighboring cabin. She was in a good mood, getting ready for church. She opened the door of cabin 28, and Sheila Sharp's world was never the same again. To understand what happened inside cabin 28, we first have to understand who Sue Sharp was. Glenna Susan Sharp, Sue to everyone who knew her, was born in Springfield, Massachusetts, in 1945. She was a woman who loved her children with a fierce, almost ferocious intensity. When her marriage to James Sharp fell apart, she didn't wait around. In July of 1979, she loaded 5 kids into a car and drove away. Her oldest son, John, was 15, a kid still trying to figure out what it meant to grow up. Sheila, 14, was the responsible one, the one who looked after the younger kids while Sue worked. Tino, 12, was the creative one, always drawing in the margins of her notebooks, and the 2 youngest, Rick at 10 and Greg at just 5 years old, were the ones who still believed the world was a safe place. They settled in Keddie in the fall of 1980. The resort had seen better days. What was once a vibrant tourist destination had turned into low-income housing. But for Sue, coming from a tiny trailer, cabin 28 felt like a palace. She was excited, Sheila would say decades later. She kept telling us we were going to make it, and for 5 months it looked like they might. Sue picked up a part-time job at the Quincy Elks Lodge and started taking typing classes. The kids enrolled in school. They made friends. The cabin next door, number 26, belonged to a man named Smartt and his wife Marilyn. Martin was a middle-aged man, an ex-military guy who drank too much and had an unpredictable temper. His stepson Justin, 12 years old, had become friends with Rick and Greg, who was just a neighbor, like any other, or so it seemed. On the night of April 11, 1981, things felt almost peaceful. John had brought his friend Dana Wingate, 17, over to spend the night. Justin was sleeping in the boys' room. Sheila had gone to a friend's cabin. Sue was awake in the living room. There is no record of anyone in the small community of Keddie hearing anything unusual that night. No screaming, no commotion, just the silence of the mountains. It was around 7 in the morning when Sheila Sharp pushed open the door of cabin 28. The smell hit her before her eyes could adjust. What she found in that small, dim room is documented in police records, but no report can capture the weight of what a 14-year-old girl carried with her for the rest of her life. On the living room floor, her mother, John, Dinah. All 3 had been bound with medical tape, electrical wire, and rope taken from inside the house itself. 2 kitchen knives were scattered across the floor, one so bent from the force of impact that the blade had folded completely, and bloodstains covered the walls like a confession no one had signed. Sue Sharp had fought the hardest. The marks on her wrists, her knees, her hands told a story of desperate resistance. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the chest and neck, and beaten in the head with the butt of a pellet gun. John Sharp, 15 years old, had been struck repeatedly with a hammer before his throat was cut. Dana Wingate, 17 years old, had been manually strangled after being beaten with the same hammer. Investigators would later believe it would have taken at least 2 men to subdue 3 people simultaneously. Sheila ran outside, came back with adults. Someone called the police, and it was only then, in the chaos of the hours that followed, that they realized something even more terrifying. Tina Sharp was not in the cabin, her bed covered in bloodstains, but Tina's body nowhere. What happened next would prove almost as disturbing as the crime itself. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office was first on the scene, but the case was quickly handed over to the California Department of Justice in Sacramento, a decision that, in hindsight, many investigators would call the first major mistake. The DOJ sent 2 agents to the scene, not from homicide, from organized crime. That choice was never adequately explained, but investigators who revisited the case decades later have a deeply unsettling theory. One of the prime suspects was Bo Boubede, a convicted felon living in cabin 26 with his friend Martin Smartt. Boubede had known ties to organized crime in Chicago. He operated under at least 2 aliases, and the DOJ apparently had its own interest in him. The 2 agents collected evidence in a catastrophic manner. Crucial pieces were never properly catalogued. Obvious leads were never followed up. Neighbors reported seeing a green van parked in front of cabin 28 on the night of the murders. That information was buried for years. And then, 3 months after the killings, Sheriff Doug Thomas, who had himself lived in cabin 28 before the Sharps moved in, resigned from the investigation and took a job with the DOJ in Sacramento. I was told the suspects were run out of town. Sheila Sharp would declare in 2016. To me, that means it was covered up. Martin Smartt left Keddie just days after the murders. He moved to Reno, Nevada. Boubede vanished as well. The hammer Smartt had told police had gone missing from his home. No one searched for it seriously at the time. And Justin Smartt, 12 years old, who had been sleeping in the boys' room the night of the crime, gave contradictory statements. In one, he said he had dreamed about the details of the murders. In another, under hypnosis, he claimed he had seen Sue with 2 men. The FBI had been called in because police suspected Tina had been kidnapped. But on April 29th, just 17 days after the murders, the FBI withdrew from the case, declaring that the DOJ was doing adequate work. The Sharp family was left alone, and Tina remained missing. Time passed, Keddie grew quieter. The tourists stopped coming. The cabins fell into disrepair. The resort that had briefly come back to life in the 1970s sank back into decay, as though the place itself knew something was rotting inside it. 3 years after the murders, on April 22, 1984, precisely on the 3rd anniversary of the crime, a man was collecting bottles in the forests near Feather Falls, in neighboring Butte County. About 100 miles from Keddie, deep in the brush, he found bone fragments, a partial skull, a jawbone. Authorities initially believed they were the remains of a Native American. Then the phone rang. A calm, anonymous voice told the police dispatcher, "I was watching the news, and they were talking about the skull they found up at Feather Falls. I was wondering if anyone had thought about the murder up in Keddie in Plumas County a few years back, where a 12-year-old girl was never found and hung up." The tip was investigated. The bone fragments were examined. Dental records were compared. It was Tina Sharp. She had been killed sometime after November 1, 1981, 6 months after her family was massacred. Advanced decomposition prevented a cause of death from being determined. But there is something even more chilling about that anonymous call. Whoever made it knew those remains belonged to Tina before investigators confirmed it with dental records. That call was logged, placed in a case file box, and never investigated. It sat there for years, untouched, until a new detective opened the box. Who made that call? Who knew where Tina was? And why was that person never identified? These are questions that only the killer can answer. In 2013, 32 years after the murders, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office reopened the case under Sheriff Greg Hagwood and Special Investigator Mike Gamberg. What they found buried in the forgotten files was enough to keep anyone awake at night. While sorting through boxes of evidence that had never been properly examined, Gamberg found a letter. It was from Martin Smartt, addressed to his wife Marilyn, written while he was in a rehabilitation clinic in the weeks following the murders. And in it, almost like a careless thought put down on paper, Martin Smartt wrote, "I have paid the price of your love, and now I have bought it with 4 lives. 4 lives, Sue John, Dana, Tina." Marilyn Smartt, when confronted with a letter decades later, said she didn't remember receiving it but recognized her husband's handwriting. There was more. The counselor who treated Smartt at the time claimed the man had confessed to the murders of Sue and Tina during their sessions, saying Tina had been killed to prevent her from identifying him because she had witnessed everything. Smartt also reportedly said he had no part in killing the boys. And in 2016, a man with a metal detector found a hammer in a pond near the cabin that matched the description of the hammer Martin Smartt had told police went missing from his home. The hammer is being analyzed for DNA. In April 2018, investigator Gamberg announced that DNA collected from a piece of tape found at the crime scene, the same tape used to bind the victims, had matched a living suspect not yet publicly identified. Martin Smartt died in 2000. Bo Boubede died in 1988, but the investigation points to others, people who may still be alive today. Cabin 28 was demolished in 2004. There was nothing left to do with it. No one wanted to rent it. No one even wanted to walk past it. It was as if the wood in those walls had absorbed something that could never be cleaned away. Keddie today is little more than a collection of ruins. Cabins rotting, roads cracked. The place that was supposed to be a new beginning for Sue Sharp became a kind of monument to failure. The failure of justice. The failure of the system. The failure of the people who were supposed to protect her family. "It's still strange to me," said Patrol Officer Rod DeCrona, who served the department for over 20 years. "I still feel uncomfortable when I drive through there." Sheila Sharp, the 14-year-old who opened that door on a Sunday morning, grew up carrying that weight. For decades, she was the keeper of her family's memory. The person who refused to let the world forget that 4 people were murdered and justice was never served. "The killer, or killers, may still be out there," she said in an interview, "and that never leaves my head. But perhaps what weighs heaviest, what may never stop weighing, is a question investigators keep returning to in private. Why were the 3 boys sleeping in the back room left alive? "You kill 3 people in a cabin and leave the bodies to be found," said former Sheriff Hagwood. "Tina couldn't be left behind. There was something about Tina that couldn't be found. I strongly feel there is something about Tina that could not be allowed. What did Tina see that night? What did she know that condemned her?" Those are questions only the killer can answer. Some cases age badly, growing more confused, more distant, colder with time. And then there are cases like Cabin 28 in Keddie that, with time, only grow heavier. Because every new detail that surfaces, the letter, the hammer, the DNA on the tape, the anonymous call, doesn't answer questions. It opens new ones, and because behind every piece of evidence, There are names: Sue Sharp, who crossed the country looking for a second chance; John Sharp, 15 years old, who invited a friend to sleep over and never woke up; Dana Wingate, 17, who had nothing to do with any of it; and Tina Sharp, 12 years old, whose bones were found in a forest 100 miles from home. Investigator Mike Gamberg once said, "I believe that one way or another we are going to solve this. We want to believe that too." If you have any information about this case, please contact the Plumas County Sheriff's Office, 530-283-6360. This was the story of Cabin 28, Keddie, California, a crime that still walks through the forests of the Sierra Nevada without a verdict, without a sentence, without an end.